The unseen weight of the wings. Dana Brooks had always known that her journey would be different. Becoming an airline pilot wasn't just about mastering the skies. It was about navigating the doubts, prejudices, and the invisible barriers placed before her long before she ever sat in a cockpit. Today, however, was supposed to be a routine flight. Dana had flown countless times from Los Angeles to New York, and yet the uneasy feeling gnawing at her gut told her that something was different. The morning started like any other. Her alarm buzzed gently, rousing her from sleep. The quiet hum of the city's early hours crept through the window, and she stretched, trying to shake off a faint unease. Dana had learned to trust her instincts, and though nothing seemed out of the ordinary, she couldn't shake the sense that the day ahead would challenge her in ways she hadn't anticipated. After her routine morning prep, she donned her neatly pressed pilot's uniform. The crisp navy fabric felt like armor, and she carefully pinned the silver wings to her chest, just over her heart. They were a symbol of her triumph, a reminder of every battle fought and won, not just against the skies, but against the doubts that had followed her from the start. Stepping outside, the cool morning air greeted her as she made her way to the airport. The drive was familiar, but today, the forecast troubled her. A storm system was expected over the Midwest, and though Dana had flown through worse, she knew a storm could always add an unexpected element of danger. But it wasn't just the weather. Something else lingered, an undercurrent she couldn't quite put her finger on. Lax was already bustling with early morning travelers as Dana navigated her way through the terminal. As always, her uniform drew glances, some curious, others impressed, and a few skeptical. After years in the cockpit, she was used to the quiet judgments, the unspoken question in people's eyes. Can she really handle this? But she had proven herself time and again. Dana had logged more flight hours and aced more emergency drills than most of her male counterparts. Yet she knew that for some, she would always be the one who didn't quite belong in the pilot's seat. As she approached the gate for Flight 297, she spotted Eric, her co-pilot, waiting. His usual grin greeted her, and she felt a wave of reassurance. Eric had always been supportive, treating her as an equal and a professional, never questioning her abilities. Late as usual, Eric teased as she approached. Always right on time, Dana retorted, her lips curving into a smile. They exchanged a few more words before heading to the plane. Everything was in order, and the pre-flight checks went off without a hitch. As Dana was about to enter the cockpit, her attention was drawn to a woman sitting in the first-class waiting area. The woman, in her mid-50s with sharp blonde hair and an air of entitlement, was watching Dana with an expression of thinly veiled disdain. "Are you serious?" the woman muttered, just loud enough for Dana to hear. "A woman? And, well, of course." Dana paused for a moment, her jaw tightening, but she continued walking. She had heard it all before. It wasn't just her gender. It was the color of her skin that always seemed to surprise people. She had learned to rise above it. But on days like today, the weight of it all felt heavier. The woman wasn't done, though. As Dana and Eric approached the plane, she stood up and marched toward them, her heels clicking on the polished airport floor. "Excuse me," she called, her voice dripping with contempt. Dana turned to face her, keeping her composure. "Can I help you?" Dana asked, her voice professional, but firm. "You're the pilot for this flight?" the woman demanded, looking Dana up and down with clear skepticism. "Yes, Mom. I'm the captain of this flight," Dana responded, her gaze steady. "There's no way I'm getting on a plane with you flying it." The woman snapped. "I don't trust my life to someone like you." Dana's heart tightened, but she maintained her calm. She had dealt with this before. Too many times, in fact. "If you have concerns, ma'am, you're welcome to speak to the gate agent. I don't need to speak to anyone. I want the real pilot, not this," the woman insisted, her voice rising. Eric, sensing the tension, stepped in. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone cool but firm. The woman's eyes brightened when she saw him, assuming she had finally found someone who would take her side. Yes, there is. I don't feel comfortable flying with her, she said, pointing at Dana. Eric's jaw clenched, but his expression remained composed. Captain Brooks is one of the most skilled pilots I've had the privilege of flying with, he said. If you have any concerns, I suggest you reconsider them. For a moment, the woman stood there, fuming, but after a tense silence, she stormed off toward the plane. Dana exhaled slowly, her body tense from holding in the frustration. You all right? Eric asked softly. Dana nodded, though the sting of the encounter still lingered. Yeah, let's just get through this flight. As Dana entered the cockpit, the familiar hum of the plane's instruments calmed her nerves. This was her sanctuary, her place of control. Here, no one could question her abilities. But as the storm loomed ahead, Dana knew that the real test was yet to come. Rising tensions and looming clouds. As Flight 297 soared into the skies, the hustle and bustle of Los Angeles disappeared beneath them, replaced by the serene vastness of the clouds. Dana Brooks leaned back in her captain's seat, finally able to relax, if only for a moment. The smooth ascent had quelled the nerves that had been simmering since the confrontation with Susan Caldwell at the gate, but Dana knew all too well that the day was far from over. The early hours of the morning had given way to a vibrant sunrise, casting a golden glow over the horizon. For most passengers, it was a picturesque scene, perfect for snapping photos through the small airplane windows. For Dana, it was a small moment of peace in the midst of what could become a turbulent journey. She cast a glance at Eric, her co-pilot, who was now reviewing their flight plan. Looks like we're cruising smoothly for now, Eric said, offering Dana a nod of reassurance. His calm demeanor always seemed to anchor her, but beneath that calm, Dana could feel the shift in the atmosphere. There was a reason the morning felt off, and the weather system ahead was beginning to make its presence known. Dana took another look at the radar. The storm that had been forecasted earlier was moving faster than expected. Pockets of turbulence were starting to form, and though they were still a few hours away from the heart of it, she could already see the telltale signs of dark clouds gathering in the distance. It's going to get rough, Dana said quietly, more to herself than to Eric, her fingers brushing over the controls with practiced ease. She had flown through storms before, much worse than this one, she reminded herself. Still, the weight of the passengers in the cabin behind her was always a sobering thought. These weren't just strangers on a plane. They were lives entrusted to her every decision. Eric glanced at her, sensing the shift in her mood. You've got this, he said. We'll ride it out like we always do. Dana appreciated Eric's confidence, but her thoughts were still lingering on Susan Caldwell. Even now, Dana could imagine Susan sitting in her plush first-class seat, seething at the fact that Dana was the one in control of the plane. Despite the calm skies outside the windows, Dana could feel the storm brewing in more ways than one. Down in the first-class cabin, Susan Caldwell was anything but calm. She had been fuming since boarding the plane, her mind a whirlwind of indignation. To her, the very idea that someone like Dana could be in charge was absurd. She had always believed that certain roles belonged to certain people, and Dana Brooks did not fit into her narrow-minded worldview of what a pilot should look like. As the flight attendants moved through the aisles offering refreshments, Susan declined, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She was still furious about the confrontation at the gate. How dare that woman, that pilot, stand there with such confidence, as if she actually deserved to be in the cockpit. Susan couldn't understand how someone like Dana could have risen so high in such a demanding field. "Excuse me," Susan hissed as a flight attendant, Megan Rivera, passed by. Megan turned, her smile professional and polite. "Yes, Mom. How can I help you?" Susan's voice was sharp. "I want to file a complaint. There's no way that woman, your captain, should be flying this plane. It's outrageous." Megan had dealt with difficult passengers before, But something about Susan's venomous tone set her on edge. Keeping her composure, she nodded. "Ma'am, Captain Brooks is one of the most qualified pilots in the industry. I assure you, you're in excellent hands." "Qualified?" Susan scoffed, her eyes narrowing. "You honestly expect me to believe that? I've seen pilots before. They don't look like her. This is dangerous. Someone like her in charge." Megan took a slow breath, her grip on the tray in her hands tightening. "Ma'am, I can understand your concern, but Captain Brooks is highly experienced and more than capable of flying this plane safely. If you would like, I can provide you with more information about her qualifications." Susan waved her hand dismissively. "I don't care about her qualifications. I want a real pilot." Megan's smile faltered for just a second, but she quickly regained her composure. "I'll make a note of your complaint, Mom," she said, before turning to move on. But Susan wasn't done. "And you better hope nothing happens to this plane, because I will make sure everyone knows about this mistake." Megan walked away, her heart pounding in her chest. She had dealt with plenty of entitled passengers before, but there was something about Susan's blatant prejudice that made her stomach turn. Taking a deep breath, she composed herself and continued her duties, hoping the situation wouldn't escalate further. Back in the cockpit, Dana was fully focused on the controls, her mind alert to the changing conditions outside. The storm was edging closer, and with it came a growing unease that Dana had learned to trust over the years. She could feel it in the air, the subtle shift in pressure, the way the clouds seemed to gather in ominous clusters ahead. "We should adjust altitude," Dana said, her voice calm but firm. "If we hit that turbulence at this level, it'll get rough for the passengers." Eric nodded in agreement. "Good call. I'll notify air traffic control." As Eric radioed in the adjustment, Dana's fingers flew over the controls, making the necessary calculations to ensure a smooth shift in altitude. She had done this countless times before, but today, with the storm approaching and Susan Caldwell's words still ringing in her ears, the stakes felt higher. As they began the gradual descent, the plane shuddered slightly, the first hint of the turbulence to come. Dana's grip tightened on the yoke, her senses fully attuned to the plane's every movement. Outside, the clouds were thickening, turning the once bright horizon into a looming wall of gray. "We're in for a bumpy ride," Eric said, glancing at the radar. "But nothing we can't handle." Dana nodded, her eyes focused ahead. But just as she was about to speak, the plane jolted, harder this time. The passengers in the cabin let out a collective gasp as the plane dipped momentarily before leveling out again. "Here we go," Dana muttered under her breath, adjusting the plane's course to navigate through the worst of the storm. The turbulence was increasing, the winds buffeting the plane with more force than she had anticipated. In the cabin, the tension was palpable. The flight attendants were moving quickly to secure the cabin, urging passengers to remain seated and buckle their seatbelts. Megan, who had just returned from her encounter with Susan, was now focused on maintaining order, but she could feel the rising anxiety around her. Susan, meanwhile, had gone from fuming to fearful. Every jolt of the plane seemed to confirm her worst suspicions that Dana was unfit to fly. Her mind raced with thoughts of disaster, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrests of her seat. "We're going to crash." Susan's panicked voice rang out, loud enough for several nearby passengers to hear. Her fear, mixed with her prejudice, was creating a dangerous combination, and the other passengers began to exchange worried glances. Megan hurried over to Susan, trying to calm her down. "Ma'am, I need you to stay calm. We're experiencing some turbulence, but the captain has everything under control." But Susan wasn't listening. "Control?" she spat. "How could she possibly have control? She shouldn't even be up there." Megan's patience was wearing thin, but she kept her voice steady. "Ma'am, please, for your safety and the safety of others, I need you to remain seated and calm." As the plane shuddered again, Susan's outburst was interrupted by the calm, authoritative voice of Dana Brooks over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are encountering some turbulence due to weather conditions, but I want to assure you that we are taking all necessary precautions and have everything under control. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened. We expect to pass through this rough patch shortly. Her voice was steady, confident, and completely in control, a sharp contrast to the chaos unfolding in the cabin. For a brief moment, even Susan was silent, her outburst cut short by the professionalism in Dana's tone. But the storm was far from over. The worst was yet to come. Storm of doubts and a test of will. The storm outside was beginning to rage in earnest, with flashes of lightning illuminating the thick clouds that now surrounded Flight 297. Dana Brooks tightened her grip on the controls, her eyes never leaving the dashboard as she navigated the plane through the turbulence. Every jolt, every sudden dip, sent a wave of murmurs and gasps through the cabin. But Dana's calm voice over the intercom had reassured most of the passengers. Most, except for one. In first class, Susan Caldwell's knuckles were white as she clutched the armrests of her seat. Her eyes darted around the cabin in fear, but there was also a glint of indignation simmering beneath the surface. To her, this turbulence wasn't just the result of an approaching storm. It was proof that Dana, the black female pilot she had insulted earlier, was unfit to fly. Susan had never seen a black woman in charge of an aircraft before, and her prejudices were blinding her to reality. "She's going to get us all killed," Susan muttered under her breath, her voice laced with panic and contempt. A few passengers nearby glanced at her nervously, unsure of how to react. But one man, seated directly behind Susan, had clearly heard enough. "Ma'am, can you calm down?" he said, his voice steady but firm. He was a middle-aged businessman, dressed in a sharp suit, and his tone carried the authority of someone used to getting what he wanted. "You're not helping anyone by panicking." Susan whipped around in her seat, her face red with anger. "I'm not panicking. I'm telling the truth. That woman, she's not fit to be a pilot. She's dangerous." The businessman raised an eyebrow, his expression one of disbelief. "I don't know what your problem is, but the captain is doing her job. This is just turbulence. It happens all the time." "Not like this," Susan snapped. "I can't believe you're all just sitting here, trusting her with your lives. Do you even know what kind of risk we're in right now?" The businessman sighed, leaning back in his seat. "The only risk here is your attitude. If you can't handle flying, maybe you should have driven." Susan opened her mouth to retort, but before she could speak, another jolt of turbulence shook the plane, harder this time. She let out a sharp gasp, clutching her seatbelt as if it would keep her grounded. Around her, the other passengers were now visibly tense, exchanging worried glances as the plane dipped again. In the cockpit, Dana was fully aware of the escalating tension in the cabin. She could feel it in the way the plane swayed, not just from the turbulence, but from the undercurrent of fear that rippled through the passengers behind her. As much as she had trained herself to focus solely on flying during moments like these, Dana couldn't completely shake the weight of Susan's earlier words. She had faced prejudice before, more times than she could count. From her first day in flight school to her years of climbing the ranks as a commercial pilot, there had always been someone who doubted her, questioned her abilities, or made her feel as though she didn't belong. But she had always risen above it. She had proven herself over and over again, each successful flight, each smooth landing, another notch in her belt of victories. Still, every now and then, someone like Susan would come along. And no matter how many years of experience Dana had, or how many accolades she'd earned, it never failed to sting. "Altitude adjusted," Eric said, bringing Dana's focus back to the present. He glanced at her, sensing the storm raging in her mind as much as the one outside. "You okay, Captain?" Dana nodded, though the tension in her shoulders told a different story. "Yeah, just trying to ride it out." Eric's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer before turning back to the controls. "We're almost through the worst of it. The storm's intense, but we've flown through worse. Dana appreciated his optimism, but she could feel the storm ahead deepening. Not just the weather, they would handle that, but the storm brewing inside her as well. Every jolt of the plane seemed to echo the doubts swirling in her mind, fueled by Susan's earlier attack. It was always like this, she realized. No matter how much she proved herself, there would always be someone questioning her right to sit in this seat. A sudden crack of thunder echoed outside the cockpit, followed by another sharp jolt. The plane shuddered violently as it descended into a thick patch of clouds. Dana's heart raced as her hands worked the controls, trying to stabilize the aircraft. For a moment, it felt like they were fighting the sky itself, the wind howling as the plane battled against the forces of nature. "Hold steady," Dana muttered to herself, her focus unwavering. This wasn't the time to doubt herself. She was trained for this. She lived for this. Eric's voice cut through the tension. "We've got a strong crosswind. I'm adjusting the rudder." Dana nodded, her hands flying over the controls with practiced precision. "I'm going to drop us another 2,000 feet. We'll hit some more turbulence, but we should clear this pocket faster." Eric radioed the new altitude adjustment to air traffic control, and within seconds, the plane began a controlled descent. The turbulence intensified for a few heart-pounding moments, and Dana could hear the commotion behind her as the passengers reacted to the plane's movements. In the back of her mind, she knew that Susan was likely feeding the panic, but Dana couldn't worry about that now. Her job was to fly this plane and keep everyone on board safe, no matter how they felt about her being the one in charge. As the plane stabilized, the worst of the turbulence seemed to pass. The storm wasn't over, but they were through the most dangerous part. For now, the skies ahead looked more manageable, though the clouds still loomed ominously around them. "Nice work," Eric said, his tone lightening as he glanced at the radar. "We're back on course. Should be smoother from here on out." Dana exhaled slowly, her body releasing the tension that had been building up over the past few minutes. The adrenaline was still pumping through her veins, but she allowed herself a moment to relax, her grip on the controls loosening slightly. "Thanks," she replied, offering Eric a small smile. But even as the immediate danger passed, Dana knew the real storm wasn't just the one outside. Back in the cabin, the passengers were starting to settle down, though a palpable sense of unease still hung in the air. Megan Rivera, the head flight attendant, moved through the aisles, offering reassuring smiles and checking on anyone who looked particularly shaken. But as she neared the first-class cabin, her eyes landed on Susan Caldwell, who was still seated with her arms crossed, a furious expression on her face. Megan hesitated, unsure whether to approach her. She had heard the woman's earlier comments, and the way Susan had spoken about Dana made her blood boil. But Megan was a professional, and she knew her job was to keep things calm, no matter how difficult the passengers were. As Megan approached, Susan's eyes locked onto her, and Megan could see the anger boiling just beneath the surface. "Don't you people even know what you're doing?" Susan demanded, her voice sharp. "This is unacceptable. I knew something like this would happen." "Ma'am, the captain has everything under control," Megan said calmly, though she could feel her patience wearing thin. "The turbulence was due to a storm, but we're through the worst of it now. There's no need to be alarmed." "Under control?" Susan scoffed. "Please, I don't care what you say. That woman shouldn't be flying this plane. We're lucky we haven't crashed already." Megan's jaw clenched, but she forced herself to keep her tone steady. "Captain Brooks is one of the most experienced pilots we have. If you have concerns, you're welcome to file a formal complaint after the flight." "I'll do more than that," Susan said, her voice lowering to a hiss. "When we land, I'll make sure everyone knows what happened here. That woman doesn't belong in the cockpit, and I'll see to it she never flies again." Megan's eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked away, knowing that there was nothing she could say to change Susan's mind. People like her didn't listen to reason. They clung to their prejudices, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. In the cockpit, Dana's thoughts were still lingering on Susan's earlier comments. Even though the flight was back on track, Dana couldn't help but feel the weight of the encounter hanging over her like a dark cloud. She had flown through far worse storms than this, both literal and figurative. But each time it happened, it chipped away at her a little more. "You all right?" Eric asked, glancing at her as they cruised through a patch of clearer skies. Dana hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, I'm fine." But the truth was, she wasn't. She was tired of having to prove herself over and over again, tired of fighting battles that never seemed to end. No matter how many smooth flights she piloted, or how many lives she safely carried across the country, there would always be someone like Susan waiting in the wings, ready to tear her down the moment something went wrong. Dana took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. This flight wasn't over yet, and she wasn't going to let one small-minded passenger distract her from what she did best: flying. The breaking point. The clouds outside had thickened, a dark and ominous mass that seemed to wrap around Flight 297 like a shroud. Inside the cockpit, the low hum of the plane's instruments was a steady reassurance, but for Dana Brooks, it was impossible to ignore the tension building in her body. The storm was far from over, and though they had passed through the worst of it for now, Dana could feel that the skies still held more challenges in store. She took a deep breath, allowing herself a moment of calm, her fingers brushing over the controls with familiarity. Flying had always been her sanctuary, the place where she felt most in control. But today, control felt like something she was constantly on the verge of losing, not because of the storm, but because of the doubts that had been planted in her mind by one passenger's prejudice. "You sure you're good?" Eric asked, his tone casual, but there was an undercurrent of concern. Dana nodded, but her silence spoke louder than words. Eric had been flying with her long enough to know when something was weighing on her mind. He didn't press the issue, knowing Dana would open up if she wanted to, but he kept a watchful eye on her as they cruised through the turbulent skies. Ahead, the clouds parted slightly, revealing a brief patch of clear sky before another wall of storm clouds loomed in the distance. Dana's hands tightened on the yoke as the plane dipped slightly, buffeted by the winds. She had been monitoring the weather reports constantly, and though the worst of the storm had passed, they weren't out of the woods yet. "We'll need to adjust our heading slightly," Dana said, her voice steady despite the tension in her muscles. "The winds are pushing us off course." Eric nodded in agreement, his hands moving over the controls to make the necessary adjustments. They had been through plenty of rough flights together, and Dana trusted him completely. But there was something about today's flight that made everything feel heavier. The weight of prejudice, of expectation, of the constant need to prove herself. "Everything looks good from here," Eric said, glancing at the radar. "We're clear for now, but the storm's still trailing us." Dana nodded, her eyes flicking between the radar and the horizon. "Let's stay sharp. The turbulence might pick up again." As they settled back into the rhythm of the flight, Dana's thoughts drifted to the cabin behind her. She knew that the passengers were still on edge, especially Susan Caldwell. Dana had tried to put the earlier confrontation out of her mind, but it lingered like a shadow, a constant reminder that no matter how skilled she was, there would always be someone questioning her right to be in the captain's seat. In the first-class cabin, Susan Caldwell was nearing her breaking point. Every time the plane jolted or dipped, her panic flared anew. She had never been particularly comfortable with flying, but today's flight had pushed her beyond her limits, and in her mind, the blame for her fear rested squarely on Dana Brooks. Susan's gaze darted around the cabin, her anxiety palpable. The other passengers, though uneasy, had mostly settled down after Dana's earlier announcement, trusting in the captain's calm, authoritative voice. But Susan couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. She glanced at the businessman seated behind her, the same man who had called her out earlier. His calm demeanor only made her angrier. How could everyone else be so blind to the danger they were in? "You're all fools," Susan muttered under her breath, her voice tinged with hysteria. "She's going to kill us all, and you're just sitting there like nothing's wrong." The businessman sighed, clearly exasperated. "Ma'am, if you could just—" "Don't ma'am me," Susan snapped, turning in her seat to glare at him. "You're just as blind as the rest of them. That woman, she's not qualified to be flying this plane. Can't you see that?" The businessman raised an eyebrow, his patience wearing thin. "And what exactly makes you think that? She's been flying this plane just fine. The turbulence is from the weather, not the pilot." "It's not just the weather," Susan shot back, her voice rising. "It's her. She doesn't belong up there. It's not safe." Several other passengers in first class turned their heads at Susan's outburst, their expressions a mix of concern and annoyance. The flight attendant, Megan Rivera, hurried over, sensing that the situation was spiraling out of control. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice," Megan said firmly, though her tone remained polite. "You're disturbing the other passengers." "I don't care," Susan retorted, her voice shrill. "I want to speak to someone in charge. This is unacceptable. I want her off this plane." Megan's patience was wearing thin, but she kept her composure. "Ma'am, Captain Brooks is fully qualified to fly this aircraft. If you have any concerns, you're welcome to file a formal complaint after the flight. But for now, I need you to remain seated and calm." Susan's face flushed with anger, but before she could respond, the plane jolted again, this time harder than before. A few passengers let out gasps as the turbulence rocked the cabin, and Megan quickly moved to secure the service cart before it tipped over. "We're going to die," Susan muttered, her voice barely above a whisper, but loud enough for those around her to hear. "We're all going to die because of her." The businessman behind her shook his head, clearly fed up. "Ma'am, with all due respect, the only thing that's making this flight unbearable is your attitude. The captain is doing her job. Maybe you should just sit back and let her do it." Susan shot him a venomous glare, but before she could respond, Megan stepped in again. "Ma'am, please," Megan said, her voice firm. "You need to calm down. The captain has everything under control." In the cockpit, Dana's focus was razor sharp as the turbulence continued. The storm had caught up with them again, and the plane was being tossed about by strong crosswinds and pockets of rough air. Dana's hands moved swiftly over the controls, adjusting the plane's course and altitude to navigate through the worst of it. "How's it looking?" Eric asked, his voice tense as he monitored the instruments. "We're still in the thick of it," Dana replied, her eyes scanning the radar, "but we're holding steady. We just need to ride this out." Eric nodded, his trust in Dana absolute. They had flown through worse storms together, and he knew that if anyone could get them through this, it was her. But even as they focused on flying, the tension in the cabin was becoming harder to ignore. "We've got a situation in first class." Megan's voice crackled over the intercom, breaking through the noise of the storm. "Passenger is becoming disruptive. She's refusing to calm down, and she's upsetting the other passengers." Dana closed her eyes for a brief moment, taking a deep breath. Of course, it was Susan. She had known that the situation would escalate eventually, but she had hoped it wouldn't come to this. "Let's just get through this turbulence," Dana said, her voice steady. "We'll deal with her once we're out of the storm." Eric glanced at her, concern etched on his face. "You sure, if she's causing that much trouble?" Dana shook her head. "Right now, my priority is getting this plane through the storm. We'll handle her later." Eric nodded, his attention returning to the instruments. "Roger that." As the plane rocked again, Dana's hands moved quickly to adjust the altitude. The turbulence was worse than she had expected, and for a brief moment, the plane felt like it was being swallowed by the storm. In the cabin, the passengers were on edge, gripping their armrests as the plane shook violently. Even the calmest of them were beginning to look uneasy. Megan moved swiftly down the aisles, checking on the passengers and offering reassurances, but she could feel the rising tension in the air. In first class, Susan was on the verge of a full-blown panic attack. Every jolt of the plane seemed to confirm her worst fears, that Dana was unfit to fly, and they were all in imminent danger because of it. "We're going to crash," Susan muttered, her voice trembling. "I knew it. I knew this would happen." But as the plane bucked again, Dana's voice came over the intercom, calm and controlled despite the chaos. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are experiencing some severe turbulence due to the storm, but I want to assure you that we have everything under control. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened. We will be through this shortly." For most of the passengers, Dana's voice was a welcome reassurance, a steadying presence in the midst of the storm. But for Susan, it was just another reminder of the fear that gripped her. She couldn't understand how everyone else could be so calm when she knew that they were in danger. But the truth was, Dana Brooks had everything under control. The plane might have been tossed about by the storm, but Dana's hands were steady on the controls, her mind sharp as she guided the aircraft through the turbulence with precision. "Almost through it," Eric said, glancing at the radar. "Just a few more minutes, and we'll be clear." Dana nodded, her heart pounding in her chest, but her mind focused. This was what she had trained for, what she had worked for her entire career. No storm, whether it was outside the plane or in the form of a prejudiced passenger, was going to stop her. The plane shuddered one last time as it broke through the thick clouds, emerging into a patch of clear sky. The turbulence eased, and for the first time in what felt like hours, the plane sailed smoothly through the air. "We're clear," Dana said, exhaling slowly. "We made it." Eric grinned, his relief palpable. "Nice work, Captain." Facing the aftermath. The storm outside had finally passed, but the turbulence inside Flight 297 was far from over. As the plane cruised smoothly through a patch of calm skies, Dana Brooks allowed herself a moment of relief, her hands slowly relaxing from the tension that had gripped the controls for the past hour. She and Eric had successfully guided the plane through one of the worst storms they had encountered in years, but there was no time to celebrate. There was still a battle brewing, and it wasn't in the clouds. "Nice work," Eric said, offering a tired but satisfied grin. "We made it through." Dana nodded, her eyes still scanning the instruments out of habit. Everything was back to normal now, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her day was far from over. Her mind wandered to the situation in the first-class cabin. Susan Caldwell had been a thorn in her side from the moment she stepped onto the plane, and Dana had known it was only a matter of time before the woman's prejudice turned into a full-blown confrontation. "I should check in with Megan," Dana said, her voice low but steady. "See how things are going back there." Eric glanced at her, concern flickering in his eyes. "You sure? I mean, you've already dealt with enough today." Eric glanced at her, concern flickering in his eyes. "You sure? I mean, you've already dealt with enough today." Dana's jaw tightened. "I need to face it. If she's causing a scene, it's my responsibility to handle it." Eric didn't argue. He knew Dana well enough to understand that she wasn't the type to back down from a challenge, even one as exhausting and emotionally draining as this. He nodded, giving her a reassuring smile. "I've got things up here. Take your time." Dana took a deep breath, gathering her resolve before reaching for the intercom. Her fingers hovered over the button for a moment, a brief hesitation that she quickly pushed aside. She had faced worse situations than this. Dangerous landings, engine failures, emergency evacuations. But confronting someone like Susan, who had already made up her mind about who Dana was and what she was capable of, felt like a different kind of challenge. "Megan, how's everything in the cabin?" Dana asked, her voice calm but firm over the intercom. There was a brief pause before Megan's voice crackled through the speakers. "Everything's under control for now, Captain, but we're still having some issues with the passenger in first class." Dana closed her eyes for a moment, willing herself to stay composed. She had known it would come to this, but that didn't make it any easier. "All right. I'll be back there in a minute." "Copy that," Megan replied. Dana turned to Eric, who gave her a nod of encouragement. "You got this," he said, his voice steady. "Don't let her get to you." Dana managed a small smile, but inside, she could feel the tension building again. This was part of the job, she reminded herself. Not just flying the plane, but managing the passengers and dealing with situations that went beyond the cockpit. She had trained for this too, but that didn't mean it wasn't exhausting. As she made her way out of the cockpit and down the aisle, the hum of the plane's engines filled the air, a constant reminder of the responsibility she carried. The passengers in the main cabin were mostly calm now, some of them dozing off, others watching movies or reading. The turbulence had shaken them, but Dana's steady voice over the intercom had done its job. They trusted her, even if they didn't know her face. But in first class, the atmosphere was different. As Dana approached the first-class cabin, she could feel the tension in the air. The passengers here were quieter, their expressions tight with unease. It didn't take long for Dana to spot Susan Caldwell, sitting rigidly in her seat, her face flushed with anger. The businessman seated behind her, who had earlier tried to calm her down, was now leaning back in his seat, his arms crossed, clearly fed up with the entire situation. Megan was standing near the service area, her face calm but her eyes betraying the stress of dealing with Susan for the past few hours. She met Dana's gaze as she approached and gave a subtle nod, indicating that things had escalated but were still under control for now. "Captain," Megan said, her voice low but professional. "The passenger in seat 1A has been very vocal about her concerns. I've tried to keep her calm, but she's been upsetting the other passengers." Dana nodded, her eyes locking onto Susan, who was now glaring at her with a mix of disbelief and fury. This was the moment she had been dreading, but she wasn't going to shy away from it. Dana stepped forward, her posture straight and commanding, her presence immediately drawing the attention of not just Susan, but the other passengers in the first-class cabin. The quiet murmurs that had filled the space died down as all eyes turned to her. She could feel the weight of their expectations, their curiosity about how she would handle this situation. "Miss Caldwell," Dana said, her voice steady but firm. "I understand you've been expressing concerns about this flight. Is there something you'd like to discuss with me?" Susan's eyes narrowed, her hands tightening into fists on her lap. "Discuss," she spat, her voice dripping with disdain. "I want to discuss why you're even flying this plane in the first place. You don't belong in that cockpit. You're putting all of our lives at risk." Dana remained calm, though inside, her frustration was building. She had dealt with passengers like this before, people who couldn't see beyond their own prejudices, who refused to acknowledge her qualifications, her experience, her right to be where she was. "Miss Caldwell," Dana began, her tone even, "I am fully qualified to fly this aircraft. I've undergone the same rigorous training as every other pilot in this airline. Your safety is my top priority, and I assure you that I am capable of handling any situation that arises." Susan scoffed, shaking her head. "Oh please, do you really expect me to believe that? Look at you. You're just..." She paused, her voice lowering to a venomous hiss. "You're not the type of person who should be in charge of something this important." Dana felt a sharp sting of anger, but she kept her face composed. She had heard these words before, in different forms, from different people, but they always carried the same message. "You don't belong. You don't know anything about me, Miss Caldwell," Dana said, her voice cool. "And your assumptions about who should or shouldn't be in charge don't change the fact that I am the captain of this flight." Susan's face flushed with anger, but before she could respond, the businessman behind her spoke up, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Enough," he said, his tone tired but firm. "We've all had enough of this. You've been complaining since we boarded, and it's not helping anyone. The captain has gotten us through a storm, and we're still in the air, aren't we? So maybe you should just sit back and let her do her job." Several other passengers in first class murmured in agreement, their expressions a mix of frustration and weariness. Susan's face reddened further, but she said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line. Dana didn't wait for her to respond. She had said what needed to be said. "If you have any further concerns, you can file a formal complaint after the flight," Dana said, her voice firm but professional. "But for now, I ask that you remain calm and allow us to complete this flight safely." With that, Dana turned and walked back down the aisle, her head held high. As she passed Megan, the flight attendant gave her a subtle nod of approval, her eyes reflecting a quiet admiration for the way Dana had handled the situation. Back in the cockpit, Dana exhaled slowly as she settled into her seat. The confrontation had gone about as well as she could have hoped, but the lingering weight of Susan's words still hung over her like a cloud. No matter how many flights she piloted, no matter how many storms she weathered, there would always be someone like Susan, ready to tear her down because of the color of her skin or the fact that she was a woman in a role that had long been dominated by men. "You okay?" Eric asked, glancing at her as she adjusted her headset. Dana nodded, her face calm, but her eyes distant. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I'm okay." But as the plane cruised through the now clear skies, Dana knew that being okay wasn't enough. She didn't want to just survive these encounters. She wanted to rise above them, to prove that no amount of prejudice could hold her back. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let people like Susan define her worth. "Let's get this plane to New York," Dana said, her voice steady as she focused on the controls. "We've got a job to do." Eric smiled, sensing the determination in her voice. "Roger that, Captain." As the plane soared through the calm skies, Dana felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just flying a plane. She was flying for every woman, every person of color who had ever been told they didn't belong in the places they had worked so hard to reach, and no storm, literal or metaphorical, was going to stop her. A flight to remember. The skies over New York City were clear as Flight 297 began its final descent. The distant hum of the engine seemed almost peaceful now, in stark contrast to the storm that had rocked the plane only hours earlier. But for Dana Brooks, the turbulence of the flight had been far more than just the weather. It had been a battle against prejudice, self-doubt, and the constant need to prove herself in a world that too often doubted her capabilities. As the city's sprawling skyline came into view, Dana couldn't help but feel a mixture of relief and resolve. The end of the flight was near, but she knew that the real journey, her personal fight against the biases she faced, was far from over. Still, today had been a victory, even if it didn't feel like it yet. "Looking good," Eric said beside her, his voice breaking through her thoughts. His gaze flicked over the instruments as they began the final approach. "We're cleared for landing." Dana nodded, her focus sharp as she prepared for one of the most crucial parts of any flight. The landing was where all her skills came together. Years of training, countless hours in the air, and a calm precision that had become second nature to her. The runway stretched out before them, and despite everything that had happened during the flight, this was her domain. "We're lined up," she said, her voice steady as her hands gripped the controls, bringing her down. The descent was smooth, the city's lights twinkling like stars below as the plane made its approach. The passengers were quiet now, their earlier tension having eased as the flight neared its conclusion. Even Susan Caldwell, seated in first class, had fallen silent, her anger replaced by a sullen, simmering frustration. But Dana wasn't thinking about her anymore. She was thinking about the landing, about the people on board who trusted her with their lives, and about what this moment meant for her. As the wheels touched down on the runway with a soft thud, a wave of relief washed over Dana. The plane slowed, the engines powering down as they taxied toward the gate. She had done it. She had flown them through the storm, through the prejudice, and through her own internal battle. And now, as the plane came to a stop, she allowed herself to exhale, the tension in her body finally releasing. Eric turned to her with a grin. "Perfect landing, Captain." As always. Dana smiled, the weight of the flight slowly lifting from her shoulders. "Thanks," she said, her voice quiet but filled with satisfaction. As the plane came to a full stop, Dana made the final announcement over the intercom, her voice calm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York. We have safely arrived at JFK Airport. On behalf of the crew, I'd like to thank you for flying with us today. Please remain seated until we have reached the gate and the seatbelt sign has been turned off." There was a soft murmur of relief from the passengers as the announcement ended, the tension that had lingered throughout the flight finally dissipating. For most of them, this was just another flight, an experience to forget as soon as they exited the plane. But for Dana, it was something more, a small but significant victory in her ongoing journey. As the passengers began to gather their belongings and prepare to disembark, Dana and Eric finished their post-flight checks, ensuring that everything had gone smoothly. Outside, the airport crew was already preparing to dock the plane, and soon the doors would open to allow the passengers to leave. "I'll let you handle the goodbyes," Eric said with a wink. "I think you've earned it." Dana chuckled softly, but there was a lingering heaviness in her heart. She knew that some of the passengers had watched her throughout the flight with curiosity, perhaps even doubt, but she also knew that others, like Susan Caldwell, had viewed her with outright hostility. Still, Dana had done her job, and she had done it well. That was all that mattered. As Dana made her way toward the front of the plane, preparing to say goodbye to the passengers, she saw Megan standing near the door, her face bright with a smile that belied the stress of the day. Megan had been a rock throughout the flight, handling Susan's outbursts with grace and professionalism, and now that the flight was over, she seemed as relieved as Dana felt. "Captain," Megan said softly as Dana approached, "that was some incredible flying. I just wanted to say, thank you." Dana smiled, a real one this time, and nodded. "Thank you, Megan. You handled things back here better than anyone could have." As they stood together, the first of the passengers began to file out, some offering polite nods or quick smiles as they passed by. A few murmured their thanks to Dana as they exited, and she acknowledged them with a gracious smile. But she knew that not everyone felt the same way. Then Susan Caldwell appeared. Her face was a mask of cold disdain, and her movements were stiff as she stepped forward. For a moment, she hesitated, her eyes locking onto Dana's, and the tension between them crackled like static electricity. The passengers around them seemed to sense it, some pausing to watch the interaction unfold. Dana met Susan's gaze calmly, refusing to look away. She had already proven herself where it mattered, in the cockpit, through the storm, and on the smooth landing. She didn't need Susan's approval, but there was still a part of her that wanted to see what the woman would do now that they were safely on the ground, and there was no storm left to blame. "Well," Susan said, her voice sharp but quieter than it had been during the flight. I suppose we landed safely after all." Dana raised an eyebrow, her expression neutral. "That's my job, Ms. Caldwell." Susan blinked, clearly taken aback by the calmness in Dana's tone. She opened her mouth as if to say something more, but then seemed to think better of it. With a huff, she turned on her heel and marched toward the exit, her shoulders tense with barely concealed frustration. As Susan disappeared down the jet bridge, Dana let out a slow breath. She had expected as much. Some people, no matter what, would never change their minds. But Dana knew that she hadn't flown this plane for people like Susan. She had flown it for herself, and for every person who had ever doubted their place in the world because of the color of their skin or the gender they were born into. Megan watched Susan go, then turned to Dana with a raised eyebrow. "Unbelievable," she muttered, shaking her head. Dana just smiled. "You get used to it," she said, though the weight of the statement lingered in the air between them. But as the last few passengers disembarked, something unexpected happened. The businessman who had defended Dana during the flight, the one seated behind Susan, stepped forward. He was tall and well-dressed, with salt and pepper hair and a look of quiet confidence. He offered Dana a genuine smile as he approached, holding out his hand. "Captain Brooks," he said, his voice warm and sincere, "I just wanted to say thank you. You handled that flight and the situation with real professionalism. It's not lost on me how difficult it must have been." Dana was momentarily caught off guard, but she quickly recovered, shaking his hand firmly. "Thank you," she replied. "I appreciate that." The businessman nodded, his smile unwavering. "I've flown a lot in my time, but this is one flight I won't forget. You're an exceptional pilot, and I hope you know that." Dana felt a warmth spread through her chest, a quiet pride that chased away the lingering shadows of the day. "Thank you," she said again, her voice softer now. As the man left, Dana stood there for a moment, absorbing the weight of his words. It wasn't often that people acknowledged the invisible battles she fought, those moments of doubt, the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, prejudices that followed her wherever she went. But when they did, it made all the difference. Back in the cockpit, Dana and Eric finished up the final checks as the airport crew prepared to disembark the plane. The day had been long and emotionally draining, but Dana felt lighter now. The flight was over, but the impact of it would linger, not just for her, but for the passengers who had witnessed what had happened. As Dana gathered her things and prepared to leave, Eric glanced at her with a grin. "So, you ready for the next one?" he teased, though there was a hint of admiration in his tone. Dana chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Always," she said, slinging her flight bag over her shoulder. As they left the plane together, the cool air of the jet bridge hit them, a refreshing reminder that they had made it through another day, another flight, another storm. And for Dana, that meant everything. Because flying wasn't just her job, it was her victory, her way of showing the world that she belonged here, no matter what anyone said. And as she walked into the bustling terminal, surrounded by the hum of travelers and the energy of the city, she knew that she would keep flying. Not just for herself, but for everyone who looked up at the sky and dreamed of soaring above the clouds. The end.